Fellas, the thing that started this channel off, the whole thing that, made me begin doing YouTube was a series that I did called MMA Rants, where I just basically ranted about random shit I wanted to get off my chest related to MMA, and I've returned to it a few times, and we're doing it again. Since we've got no UFC this weekend, I thought I'd do a little bit of an MMA rant and just go over a few topics discussed with MMA that I'm just not really feeling recently. Some topics that I need to get off my chest, whether it be what the UFC are doing or some fan reactions to things. We're just going to be going over a few topics, so let me know your thoughts on the topics discussed in this video. But the first rant topic is Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad, and I feel like people are completely discrediting this fight too much. People have been disgracing it, say that it's a shame to be on a pay-per-view, and they think it's going to be an extremely boring fight. I think this fight is going to be more interesting than people are making it out to be. I understand you've got two fighters in there who don't really tend to be that interesting when they fight over opponents, and people have seen that and they're immediately thinking this is going to be a really bad fight. I actually don't think this is going to be as bad as people are making it out to be. First reason, look at their first fight. Their first fight, listen, I'm not going to act like this is going to be Gaethje versus Holloway or even fight of the night, but their first fight wasn't even that bad. It was Leon Edwards piecing up Belal Muhammad, which is ironic because Colby Covington insults his father. He takes him to a little slow-paced decision. But then you've got Belal Muhammad just existing and Leon tries taking his head off. But no, the first fight wasn't even that bad. It was actually quite a good performance by Leon Edwards until, obviously, the eye poke. And then I feel like, look at them recently. Belal Muhammad's going to be pushing a pace on Leon Edwards. He's been waiting for this title shot for so long. He's going to be pushing a pace like he does in every fight. But the only difference is, this time Leon Edwards has the full package. The dude can strike. The dude can grapple. It's going to be a decent fight. I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying it's going to be fight of the night. I'm not saying it's going to be Gaethje Holloway part 2. I just think it's going to be a better fight than what people are making it out to be. We're going to see Leon Edwards clip Belal Muhammad. We're going to see Belal Muhammad push a pace. It's going to be way better than Edwards versus Covington. And to be honest, I think it has potential to be better than Edwards versus Usman 2 and 3. So I feel like the whole narrative that this is going to be a really, really boring fight just because these guys haven't had the most impressive fights recently. Fair enough, the build-ups might be, the build-up might be quite AIDS, and I understand why you might think on paper it's not a good fight, but when you actually break down the styles and look back at their first fight, I think this is going to be a lot better than people are making it out to be. I would prefer Aspinall versus Blades to be the main event, and I do think that is going to be a better fight than this, but I feel like Leon versus Belal, even though it's fun to hate on, the fight, I think it needs to get more respect than it's getting. So the first rant is Leon versus Belal. Trust me, I think it's going to be better than people are making it out to be. Anyway, the expectations are super low, that it can only kind of get better from here. Everyone's put the expectation in the bar to an all-time low, so surely it can only get better from here. So yeah, Leon Belal, that's my first rant. The next rant that I've got is on a pay-per-view, and it's specifically UFC 303. I've heard a lot of people shitting on this card recently. Listen, I understand UFC 303 is a below-average pay-per-view, but it's because it's a McGregor card. Of course, it's not going to be a great stacked card when McGregor's headlining it. We have had McGregor headliners in the past that have been way worse than UFC 303. UFC 303, quite frankly, for a McGregor card, if that's the standard, a McGregor card, it ain't that bad. I mean, obviously, we've got McGregor versus Chandler in the main event, which I'm not going to go over now, but that is it's going to be the biggest fight this year, which is why they don't need to stack the card. The core main event, we've got Jamal Hill, the dude who just headlined UFC 300, the biggest card of the year, taking on Carlos Ulberg. I think this is going to be a banger. Carlos Ulberg, for me, he's a top 5 light heavyweight. I know the rankings don't really show that, but fuck the rankings. Carlos Ulberg, I honestly think he's going to clip Jamal Hill. It's going to be such a fun fight on the feet between two high-level strikers. Jamal Hill returning too quickly, so he's got a high chance of getting KO'd. That is a big co-main event. And then we've got Mayra Bueno Silva on the card, who just fought for a belt. We've got Andre Fili versus Cub Swanson. That's going to be an absolute banger. I can almost bet money and guarantee that one of those guys is going to get flatlined. Probably going to be Andre Fili. We've got Joe Pyfer on the card, who just got compared to Francis Ngannou. We've got Charles Jourdain on the card. Honestly, it's shaping up to be a good card. Peyton Talbot as well. One of the biggest prospects in the UFC as of right now. He's on the card too. This is actually not that bad of a card. People are acting like it's UFC 297 level. This is better than UFC 301 and 297. And it's headlined by Conor McGregor. No, I don't know why people are acting surprised. Oh my gosh, it's not that stacked. Of course it's not going to be stacked. McGregor's headlining it. They don't need to stack a card when Conor McGregor's headlining it. I'm not acting like it's better than 299 or 300. On paper, if you go under the McGregor fight, I guess it is a below-average fight card. But I don't understand why everyone's acting surprised and whinging about it as if we didn't know that in the first place. So, UFC 303, quit complaining because it's actually a pretty decent card. And I don't just want to be one of these guys that starts defending every single card. I did it for UFC 301 as well, but it's a good card, in my opinion, especially for the fact that McGregor's headlining it. And I think there's going to be a lot of finishes and a lot of bangers on this card when you really look at the fights that have been made. So that's my rant about UFC 303. The next rant I've got, I have done this kind of rant in a video before, but I want to touch over it again, and I'm still curious. And it's the amount of #1 contender fights we have in the middleweight division. So obviously this weekend, well not this weekend, but at UFC 302 on June the 1st, we have Sean Strickland taking on Paulo Costa. If Strickland can beat Paulo Costa, because he arguably deserves a title shot now, he's definitely going to be in there for the next guy to fight for the belt in the middleweight division. But then we've also got a fight night main event between Whittaker and Chimaev. The winner of that fight is definitely going to want a title shot too. I mean, Whittaker's just beaten Paulo Costa. He's been at the top of the middleweight division for the longest time. If he can be one of the biggest names in the UFC in Khamzat Chimaev, he's going to want a title shot too. And then we've also got Cannonier versus Imavov. Cannonier's literally beaten Sean Strickland and decimated Marvin Vettori. If he can then beat Imavov on top of that and get the cherry on top, he's also going to want a title shot. So we've got 3 #1 contender fights in the middleweight division, and I really don't know what the UFC are going to do. And the craziest part about this is the guy who's going to be fighting for the belt next ain't even a part of any of these fights. The guy who's going to be fighting for the belt is Adesanya. So we're going to have Adesanya versus Dricus at UFC 305. And we're going to have potentially 3 guys who want the next title shot, meaning one of those guys is going to have to wait for the other 2 to go first. So unless they match these #1 contender guys against each other, I really don't know what the UFC are going to do. It would have made more sense to do Sean Strickland versus Robert Whittaker as the official #1 contender fight, and then we could have done Khamzat Chimaev versus Paulo Costa to let Chimaev climb the rankings, especially when Paulo Costa's coming off a loss to Whittaker. It doesn't make sense why he's fighting Strickland. And then Cannonier can fight Imavov, and then the winner of that can kind of wait in the stands, while in the meantime, Dricus faces Adesanya at UFC 305. That would have been the most logical choice. So they've got 3 #1 contender fights, and I'm really curious, after all of these fights are done, with what the UFC are going to do with these guys, because there's 3 guys who arguably deserve the title shot, and none of them are going to get it next. So that's my little rant about UFC, or the middleweight division of the UFC. The next rant I've got is about the UFC, and this has been going on for quite a while now, and it's UFC announcing fights before the fighters have even booked. This is really bad. I mean, first of all, it shows that the UFC aren't really being, they're not really working well with the fighters if they're announcing fights before fighters have even, physically announced it. I mean, this has been going on occasion after occasion after occasion. I mean, literally next weekend, Sean Strickland versus Paulo Costa. I'm sure the fight's going to happen, but apparently Paulo Costa still never signed the contract and the UFC have announced it. And there's some people that think this fight could actually get cancelled, especially when you look at Costa's track record of pulling out of fights. That's not good for the UFC. Volkov versus Pavlovich is another example. The co-main event of UFC Saudi Arabia, Pavlovich is going to be taking on Volkov. When that fight first got announced, I always knew there was something skeptical about it, because even though it's a fun fight, I always thought those guys were pretty close, and they were, kind of, I wouldn't say friends, but they were close, they trained together. And apparently they never signed to fight each other, so that's another thing that the UFC have done, where they've booked a fight before, or they've signed a fight before, even if the fights have signed the contract. And then another one recently, Pereira versus Dolidze, Mikel Pereira versus Dolidze. Them guys are close with each other too, and that fight has been announced for UFC. Well, it's not, I forgot what card it's on, but that's been booked for a UFC card, so yeah, a lot of fights keep getting booked before they've actually been physically signed by the fighters, which is another big problem that the UFC are doing. And if the UFC keep this up, this can get real bad. We might have more and more pullouts. The fighters might, be less reliable for the UFC. And I think it's just not a good tactic you want the UFC to be doing as a fan. So this keeps consistently happening. It's happened on multiple bases. I've just named 3 examples there. So that's another rant. UFC announcing fights before they've actually been signed. And then the final rant is the UFC 304 start time. I'm a bit late to the party. I understand this was the talk of the topic about 4 weeks ago, and I do have a UFC 304 video coming out tomorrow, which is more in depth a rant about that card. But right now, yeah, the start time really doesn't make sense. I can sort of understand in the sense that, America is a bigger audience than the UK. I understand that, so the UFC are trying to appeal a pay-per-view to the American audience, and the fighters do get pay-per-view points on top of that, so I guess it's good for the fighters, the main and the co-main event. But first reason, we've had events in the UK on pay-per-view before. UFC 286 was in the UK. That went great. It's kind of unfair for the UK fighters. Paddy Pimblett talked about it, having to literally adjust their entire schedule just for this one card. And then for the UK fans, I find it kind of rude, yeah. If you're going to be doing an event in the UK with tickets, and you're saying these guys buying tickets have to stay up till 11 till 6 AM to watch the fight card, I think that's really unfair on UK fans. I think the fighters are at a disadvantage. I think the fans are at a UFC are at a disadvantage. And guess who's in the advantage? It's Dana White. Wants more money. I understand from a business perspective it might be the smart choice, but it just doesn't make sense. I mean, the Abu Dhabi cards are in normal time. The Australian cards seem to be in normal time, but for some reason, now that it's in the UK, out of nowhere, they've just flipped the fight card on a random time. So I'm not happy about that. I'm still going to watch the card regardless, don't get me wrong, but I think it's quite unfair for UK fans, especially the ones going to buy tickets. But that is my rant about a few topics in MMA right now that I'm not too happy with. I might do this every couple of weeks, just things that are, in my head that I need to get off my chest around the UFC world. So let me know your thoughts on these rants. Do you agree with what I've said in this video? Because these are things I need to get off my chest. And I will have a video more in depth tomorrow talking about UFC 304. But anyway, thank you for watching.